that I've been engaged as an economist and an economic writer, analyzing the developments in the global financial system, the dollar system in particular. And with the onset of the current global crisis in August of 2007, it became clear the results of that crisis, the way that the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. government as a whole, the Congress, stooped over backwards to bail out the Wall Street banks that created the crisis through fraud, deception, criminal behavior, to the tune of trillions of dollars of taxpayer money. And as the chairman of Goldman Sachs, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, Blankfein, said in an interview with the London Times recently, he said, "We're simply bankers doing the work of God." And that is their attitude. They see themselves as the gods of money. They're a class above mere mortals, and they can do what they wish. And that, I think, is the basic background.
We're meeting in London, which is obviously part of a Europe that's in crisis at the moment. Yeah. How do you view the things that are going on in the Eurozone at the moment? How bad and how systemic do you think it is?
It's a relative thing. You have to compare the crisis going on with Greece and the Eurozone and the various countries such as Portugal, Italy, and Spain in a context of a global system. The center of gravity of the global crisis is New York, is the United States, is the U.S. financial system, the dollar system, and to a secondary extent the pound and the City of London. That was where all of the toxic waste, if you want to call it that, was created to be sold onto the world market. The crisis in Greece is a tempest in a teapot in comparison with that. It's been politically activated by the same gods of money, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan Chase, Citigroup, and so forth, who also are behind Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, the three giant rating companies that rate the credit of countries like Greece. So conveniently, just when the dollar was coming under a very, very severe attack last November of 2009, there was a rating downgrade of Greece and an exposure of the fact that Greece had manipulated its books to get into the Eurozone in 2002. And lo and behold, who was the bank that enabled Greece to do this? J.P. Morgan Chase, but above all, Goldman Sachs. And that Goldman Sachs, at the time the crisis broke last November, Goldman Sachs was the advisor, financial advisor, the prime one, to the new Greek government of Papandreou. So Goldman Sachs and Wall Street have played an insider role in this whole Greek crisis from the beginning.
But do you think that there are systemic problems within the Eurozone quite apart from that?
There are political problems within the Eurozone. The Eurozone is a concept based on the false foundation, in my mind. But it's a top-down creation by Europe to try to create a counterweight to Wall Street and the dollar system. Germany and France cobbled together a compromise on the Greek question and are developing a long-term strategy for the possibility of future such national crises, a monitoring, transparency, all these beautiful words. But I don't see a systemic crisis. I think Wall Street and certain offshore hedge funds, George Soros among them with his Quantum Fund or Soros Fund Management Group, they are making concerted actions. They've had meetings that have been exposed in the media to talk about concerted attack on the euro in the background of the Greek crisis.
Do you think that we are possibly witnessing the end of the European Union as both a political and financial alliance?
What will happen now depends on a lot of internal changes within the Eurozone and a lot of political decisions, but I don't see it as the end of the EU in the near future.
What do you think the US interest is in getting involved in settling the Greek crisis through the IMF? Is it an attempt to divert attention away from what's going on in the US domestically and in fact exacerbate the situation in Europe?
Well, the IMF, people should realize that it was created by Wall Street and Washington and the US Treasury in 1944 to be an instrument of US economic dollar domination of the world economy after the war. and in that regard has been enormously successful. Washington to this day has a veto minority voting share in the IMF Board of Directors, so any decision that is uncomfortable for the U.S. Treasury or the U.S. government is vetoed by Washington. In that regard, the IMF tends to act as a rubber stamp for the U.S. Treasury. So there was a huge debate within Euroland about bringing the IMF in on the Greek crisis or future crises. In the end of the day, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, was under enormous domestic pressure. German elections are coming up in the regional states. So electoral politics got mixed up with the economic crisis in Greece, and a very rotten compromise came out that most European governments were opposed to, but in the end of the day, it's what they decided. This is a classic case of covert economic warfare of the dollar system against the euro in order to take pressure off of the dollar at a time when it's very vulnerable. The U.S. economic crisis is not anywhere near being over. There is no U.S. recovery. It's all government propaganda mills that are churning out fraudulent statistics and false expectations of recovery. But there is no basis of recovery in the U.S. economy, and will not be for at least another decade or 15 years, as I calculate.
What does it say about the stability of Germany that it has requested US involvement in the shape of the IMF to sort out a problem that's going on inside Europe? Doesn't it undermine the entire idea of a single Europe?
It undermines the idea of a unified Europe, most definitely. To bring the IMF into Euroland, into the Eurozone, is more than symbolic, even though the portion of IMF participation is limited to a minority portion. Bringing the IMF in is setting the fox among the chickens, if you will, inside Euroland. And it's a reminder to financial markets that the IMF has the potential to destabilize any kind of European attempt at creating stability. So it's a very bad move in my mind.
What do you think the future of the euro is?
What I see for the Euroland and for the EU in general is the elites that determine policy up to now in Europe are schizophrenic in the following way. The relationship of Europe to the Atlantic bridge to Washington since 1945 has been the link of stabilization for Europe during the Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 90s, the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. Rather than dissolving NATO in a careful and systematic way, Washington extended NATO right up to the doorstep of Moscow. They attempted through color revolutions in Ukraine, etc., Georgia, to put in de facto puppet governments of tin pot dictators like Saakashvili or Yushchenko in Ukraine to bring those countries into NATO and create this global imperium dominated by Washington. Well, that has not succeeded. In the meantime, what has happened is the countries of the Shanghai Cooperation Group, Russia, China, the various Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and so forth, have been, by force of necessity of this encirclement from Washington, the Pentagon and so forth, have been forced to draw together in closer cooperation on energy questions, on defense questions, and so forth. And the growth dynamic, and I've been throughout Eurasia in the past 20 years in my travels and presentations in connection with my various books. The economic dynamic in Eurasia, as people like Zbigniew Brzezinski warned back in the 1990s, that has the potential, the only potential in the world to overshadow the economic domination of the United States. And that's de facto what's happening. The dynamism coming out of Eurasia is such that the European elites are literally schizophrenic. Do we orient increasingly toward Eurasia, toward Central Asia, Russia, China, and so forth, for our energy resources, for our economic stability, for our trade outlets, or do we lock our future, the Euroland future, into the sinking Titanic called the dollar system?